I'd like to say before I start telling you about the book, there are so many stories. I like to tell history in story fashion. I think you enjoy it much more. It's much more enjoyable book. You know, some authors just feel like they've got to fill the book with all the dates and all of the technical details. I like to take it from the beginning of a story to the end. And I need to say that there are many stories in this book. I didn't realize how packed it was with details of stories until I started preparing for this lecture. I said, wow, all of this stuff in there. And any of these, a lot of stories could go off on tangents, you know, about each person. But I was determined to make it as relative to the old hotel as possible. So that was my challenge with all of the stories I found. And so thank you everyone for being here. And I see Rick is here, General Manager of the hotel. Thank you, sir. He's been very encouraging as well. And all of the other dignitaries, all of you who are here, thank you very much for coming. Well, let's get into this. Of course, you can't talk about the Santa Fe Trail without talking about William Becknell. And so we'll start with him. William Becknell is known as the founder of the Santa Fe Trail. And he was a merchant in Franklin, Missouri. And this was a tumultuous time back in the early 1820s. The U.S. had recently, well, in 1800, purchased the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon. And it's always interesting to see how those things transpired. Most of Napoleon really had no idea what the boundaries were for the Louisiana Purchase. And the Spanish weren't really sure where their boundary was. So he just said, yeah, I'll sell it to you, $15 million. And it doubled the size of the United States at that time. And then it was up to the new owners to try to figure out where the borders were between the French and Spanish and American territories. So this was that time of exploration, looking at where the countries really met. And Franklin, Missouri is a little town, a little east of Kansas City today. And it was the place where the first people came over on the old Santa Fe Trail. The first Americans, I should say. And William Becknell, there was, you've heard that term, go west, young man, go west. That's what people were doing. They were coming out to Missouri because there was plenty of property and pretty cheap too. And so he invested quite a bit in property, so much so that he ended up $1,000 in debt. And in those days, well, let's say today, that would be $25,000 or more in today's money. And so he was in trouble, and he was trying to find a way out of there were about 5 people who he owned, creditors who he owed money to. And so he's got to thinking, well, maybe if I go out and do some trading out in New Mexico, perhaps, I can avoid being taken to debtor's prison. And so finally, in the autumn of 1921, one of the creditors was able to get a court date to discuss his debt in the court. And so he decided it's time to get out of here. So he departed Franklin on September 1, 1821. And it was a little risky because New Mexico was still a Spanish territory, and the Spanish did not permit any outsiders to come into Spanish territory. There were no hotels for tourists, as we know it today, and anyone who came in from outside, French, Americans, or whatever, they just put them in jail. The jails were the hotels. And so it was a little risky. But we will find out in a few minutes that it worked out very well for him. And so he started traveling across the prairies, headed for New Mexico. And in those days, really the only thing that people knew was you keep going west, directly west, until you see mountains. When you see mountains, you turn left and go around the southern end of this big wall, the Rocky Mountains, and come in, go around the southern end. And so that's what they did. They would go west until they saw mountains, and then go down south around the end. And in the process, he was intercepted when he got to an area just south of Las Vegas, New Mexico, I understand. And all of a sudden he was accosted by a military unit led by Captain Don Pedro Ignacio Gallego. And at that point, he heard for the first time that Mexico had claimed independence from Spain. And that had happened just a month after he left his home back in Missouri. So he was very fortunate. And so he was able to come into Santa Fe. And the first village they would meet when they came in from the east was San Miguel del Vado. That's down in the area of Villanueva down in south of Las Vegas, New Mexico. And that was the first village. And it was an important one because that was the place where you could ford most easily the Pecos River. And if you go down there, there's still buildings back from those early days in the 1800s that are in ruins. And I have a picture of that in the book. And so they came into San Miguel del Vado and then continued on to Santa Fe, and they arrived here on November 16, 1821. They had traveled 1,000 miles in 77 days. At that time, on that first trip, he did not have wagons. It was only him and his 4 or 5 colleagues on horses. They were horseback that very first trip. And he came and just stayed a very short time, just a couple of weeks. And then he hightailed it back to Franklin, a rich man, from all of the goods he had sold here in Santa Fe. And so that's William Becknell, the father of the Overland Trail. And then when he went back, he was asked to help improve the trail. And so he worked some on the trail and also brought other, came a year later with a new caravan on the Santa Fe Trail. Another pioneer I had discovered, didn't know anything about this guy, Thomas James. And I call him the founder of the river trail because he was a merchant and he was having a difficult time. He was about to go bankrupt. And he too decided he would go west and see what he could find out. And so he left not knowing when Mexico would become independent, but that happened also while he was en route to Santa Fe. And he had, in St. Louis, he was from St. Louis, and he had recently met some merchants who had come to New Mexico, and they were immediately put in jail. That was their hotel room for 10 years. 10 years in jail. And this is what would usually happen when someone came in from outside. The Spanish were quite ruthless that way. So they had been in jail for 10 years down in Chihuahua City. And so he got a lot of information from them. But even so, in his moment of bankruptcy, he said, I'm heading west too. So he got a keel boat, and went down the Mississippi to about 100 miles south of what was then a little village called Memphis. And he found the mouth of the Arkansas River. And he started up the Arkansas River. And he had been told that they were all friendly Indians, no need to worry. So he loaded up his boat with biscuit, whiskey, flour, lead, and powder that he would give to the Native Americans that he would meet on the way. And he traveled along the Arkansas River, past Awe Post. Awe Post was the first capital of the territory of Arkansas. It had just changed from Awe Post over to Little Rock. So he went through Little Rock on the river, and the river became too shallow in Oklahoma, and so he left the boat and he bought horses from the Osage Indians and continued on his travel to Santa Fe. And as soon as he got out in a certain part of the plains, away from Oklahoma, into Colorado, and he was met by a Comanche tribe. And they started stealing things, stealing his merchandise, and they were quite menacing. And he thought, this is it, I've lived my life, and this is going to be the end. All of a sudden, a military unit came galloping up and said, Tabajo, Tabajo, these are white men, save them, keep them, don't hurt them. So he was saved by the military, but really his savior was Chief Cordaro, Chief Cordaro. He was the chief of another Comanche tribe, and he had heard about these people who were in peril, and he notified the military unit, and the military unit traveled, the captain said they traveled 20 miles that morning when they heard about their predicament to come out to save them. So this chief really was their savior. And the military unit escorted them over to San Miguel de Vado so they could cross the Pecos River, and they came into Santa Fe. They arrived 2 weeks after our friend Becknell. The only difference was he stayed for several months, whereas Becknell came and sold his stuff and immediately went back. Thomas James stayed for several months. And it's through him that we learn about how hospitality was reborn during that time here in Santa Fe. And Chief Cordero came to Santa Fe while he was here, and just wanted to check and make sure he was all right. And from the description, it sounds like he gave the local people here, the governors and his staff, a lecture about being friendly to the Americans now, because they were now our friends. And the interesting thing is, too, he stayed long enough that, Santa Fe had not been free for forever. It was always Spanish territory. And they decided in February of the next year, 1822, they would have a celebration to celebrate independence. But they had no idea how to do it. They'd never experienced this before. And so they asked Thomas James to help them out as they planned their celebration of independence. And so he showed up on the day that was appointed, and he said to the governor, now, you address the people, and the governor said, I don't know how to do that, you do it. So he had the privilege of raising the first flag for New Mexico in the plaza when they had their celebration for independence. He claims he raised he suggested that they have a flag with an eagle on it, but the governor's staff here said, no, we want a handshake on the flag. So there are two. The flag that he raised had two hands shaking. And so that was quite an interesting thing. And it is through him that we really find more information. And while he was here, he rented a room, or it could have been a large part of a house, on this site from a man by the name of Don Francisco Ortiz. And I call him the third father of the pioneer of the Santa Fe Trail, the father of hospitality. So he rented a house to Thomas James, and then he served as his counselor and advisor and interpreter, took him to meet the governor, and he always gave good advice to James about how he should act while he was in New Mexico and how he should relate to the government. And at one point, James decided he wasn't doing much here in Santa Fe. His merchandise was gone, and he needed to go somewhere else. So he thought he would go into Mexico. And Don Francisco offered his son to be a guide to take him down to Mexico. And as I mentioned, he was very much involved in the independence celebration here. So I call him the father of hospitality, Don Francisco Ortiz. In those days, it was interesting to see what people were saying about the city. Here, I grabbed these three descriptions for your interest. Becknell himself said it's in a valley of the mountains about 2 miles long and 1 mile wide and very compactly settled. The walls of their houses are 2 or 3 feet thick, built of brick, and are uniformly 1 story high, having a flat roof made of clay. They do not know the use of plank and have neither chairs nor tables. And that one sentence there gave me a clue that he probably also rented a house or a room in one of the houses that were on this site. There was no hotel at that time. It was just, and these people who lived here were called the ricos, the richer people in the city. And James himself said, it is beautifully situated on a plain of dry and rolling ground at the foot of a mountain, and a small stream runs directly through the city. The houses are all flat on the roof. We all noticed that right away. Josiah Gregg was another fellow who came out for his health in 1831, and he said, the town is irregularly laid out. The only attempt at anything architectural compactness consists of 4 tiers of buildings whose fronts are shaded with a fringe of portales of the rudest possible description. They stand around the public square. And then there was Matt Field. Matt Field was a very interesting guy. He was an actor. He was an actor from St. Louis. And he was failing in health, and his doctor didn't know what to do for him. He said, why don't you take a trip out west? And so he wrote quite extensively about his trip out here. And so he was another very big source of information. Here's what he said in 1839. There, within a half a mile of the base of the mountain, a small spot of the vast green plain was dotted with low 1-story buildings, reminding us irresistibly of an assemblage of molehills. So those are early descriptions of the city. And it was estimated there were about 6,000 people here in Santa Fe at that time, the population. The next year, Becknell came back. He had 3 wagons. And we know about his trips because he wrote articles for the New Orleans Picayune newspaper. And in 1824, 25 wagons set out from Franklin. Franklin was the beginning place. But Franklin was on the Missouri River. And the Missouri River was constantly changing its course. And eventually, the river swallowed up the little town of Franklin. And when that happened, people started going to this new little town called Independence, which today is a suburb of Kansas City. And 1826, Charles Bent. And Charles Bent looms large in the history of New Mexico. I'll tell you more about him in a minute. But he headed a 25 wagon train and decided to build a fortress-like trading post on the Arkansas River, and where the trail crossed the river. And you'll see a picture of that fort that he made. Quite an impressive place. If you ever get a chance, you're up in La Junta, Colorado, be sure to see the first fort that he built. And interestingly enough, before all was said and done, he became related to Kit Carson. Kit Carson was a kid 15 years old when Bent, in 1826, organized the wagon train coming out. And he had been working in a saddle factory. Got tired of it. He wanted adventure, and so he signed up with Bent. And when Bent said, "Well, what can you do for the wagon train?" He said, "Well, I can shoot straight." I can shoot straight. So on that, he was given a position taking care of the animals on the wagon train. And then I wanted to try to give you a picture of what it was like in Santa Fe when the wagons did actually finally get here. And so I'm quoting a lot of Matt Field on this. And he said routine life would carry on until it was known that the wagon train was on its way. And then the arrival of a caravan from the States is both to the natives and transient residents an affair of much enlivening interest. Excitement grew intense as the cavalcade entered the town proper, and whips were heard cracking around the distant corner. The mule and oxen drivers tried to outdo each other with all the noise and commotion they could create, especially the cracking of whips and yells at the patient animals that had brought them to the end of the trail. On they came, on up the street, and old and young, American and Mexican, all sorts and sexes, assembled at the doors and windows and in the street to witness the great procession. So you can imagine what excitement it was when a wagon train finally arrived after a couple of months across the prairies, finally arriving at civilization. It was a great event. The old Santa Fe Trail started over there in Franklin originally, then from Independence near Kansas City, and came out to Santa Fe. And you see it split there. There was a fork, the northern route, and coming down south was the Cimarron Cutoff. And the Cimarron Cutoff didn't have as much water as the northern route. So they had to decide, what time of year it was. Would there be enough water, depending on which way they came. Of course, the northern route came then eventually over the Raton Pass. The first people I'd like to tell you about after all of this is the Donahoe family. Mary Dodson's family was from Tennessee, and William Donahoe's family was from Kentucky, and they moved to Boone County in Missouri in the late 1820s. And she married William Donahoe. And in 1833, with their child, they had a little girl. They joined one of Charles Bent's caravans headed for Santa Fe. And they rented what was then known as the United States House here. Because anyone in town who wanted to find an American, they would say, "Go to the United States House over here on the corner." So William was away. He was a trader. He would travel all around the area, doing buying and selling. I suppose he'd go up to Taos, he'd go down to the Albuquerque area, and so on. And so that left the house to his wife, Mary, and she started renting rooms, and I think she's the first one who sort of had the vision of having a guest house there. And at the same time they were here, and eventually the United States House became known as the United States Hotel. But while this was all happening, 800 miles south, there was a group of people coming out to take over land and start a community down in southern Texas near the Rio Grande River. And this was east of the Rio Grande. If you can picture in your mind now, the Rio Grande is the border between Texas down there and Mexico. But at that time, Mexico still claimed property on the eastern side of the Rio Grande. And Mexico was inviting people to come there and have free land and help start a community. And so there was this group that came by boat from New York. They got out at Matagordo Bay and traveled up to this area where they were trying to start a new community. This was about the time of the Battle of the Alamo. The Mexican army and the American army were passing around, and Um, it was tough life. They thought they were coming to a great place for farming. They just got there and discovered it was just cactus and sand, and realized they had a very tough time. Many of them were discouraged and left. But this lady, Sarah Ann Horn, and her husband and 2 children stayed till the last. Eventually, everyone gave up, and the last group decided to leave. And as they were leaving, and the wagons from Mexico, the army wagons were going back and forth across the river there, they were attacked by a Comanche band. And her husband was killed, and she and her 2 little boys were taken captive by the Comanches. And so they started traveling with the Comanches all around Texas. They would go slowly traveling around looking for a new place to set up their camp. Eventually, after about a year or more, the Comanches started coming north into New Mexico. And they were out here in the plains just east of Pecos area to do some trading with the Pueblo Indians. You know, that was a great trading post out there at Pecos. And while they were there, some men bartered for Sarah Ann Horn to try to release her. They were successful. They traded her for a couple of beautiful horses and other things with the Comanches. And so she was rescued. She had no idea who was trying to rescue her. But when she got into Santa Fe, she discovered it was Mr. Donahoe, William Donahoe, the owner of the United States Hotel here. And so she was very grateful, and she eventually went back to Missouri with them. And she didn't last very long. She never saw her 2 young boys again. And it wasn't long, maybe a year, before she passed away herself because she was so battered from her experience. And so it was through William's intervention that she was rescued. That's one story that you'll find early in the book. Another one that comes up pretty soon is concerning this man, Don Manuel Armijo. And Matt Field, this is when Matt Field, the actor from St. Louis, came out. And it's also when Texas was feeling its muscles for the first time. And Armijo was from a ranch near Albuquerque. And there was a little resurrection here in Santa Fe, and he took advantage of that to come and impose himself as the governor of New Mexico. There are a lot of details to this that you'll have to find in the book, I'm afraid. We don't have time right here. And this is when Matt Field arrived, 1839. And then in 1841, President Lamar of Texas decided to claim New Mexico. When Santa Anna surrendered at San Jacinto, that famous battle after the Alamo, when the Texans won the battle, he said, yeah, okay, I'll give you New Mexico, and everything east of the Rio Grande is part of Mexico. Well, once again, it was an emperor who didn't really understand borders. And so the Texans felt like they owned everything east of the Santa Fe pioneers, the Santa Fe pioneers. And this was all advertised in the newspapers down in Austin. And so it was public knowledge that this group was being organized. Eventually, they had about 200 people who started north, coming up to Santa Fe. And they thought the New Mexicans would welcome them because they were coming to say, welcome to be part of Texas. Well, the people in this area didn't like that idea too much. And so Armijo, as soon as they arrived, they were in quite a weakened condition. They had run out of food. They were, by this time, they were eating lizards or anything else they could find to eat. And so they were in poor physical shape. And he was able to just round them up and send them to Mexico City. And they were put in jail. They filled the Mexico City jails there for about a year. Finally, in 1 year later, they were permitted to return to Texas. So that's another story that is quite interesting there. And then, of course, you can't bypass the Mexican-American War when the U.S. Army came out to take over the country here. It turned out that in 1845, General Zachary Taylor was sent to Texas to claim Mexican territory east of the Rio Grande for the United States. Well, Mexico still claimed that was their territory. And so they attacked the Americans. Several officers and their men were killed. And that gave President Polk an opportunity to declare war on Mexico. And that started the Mexican-American War. Most of the battles took place down in Mexico. The result was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that treaty gave New Mexico and California to the United States. And coming with the Army was an interesting couple, Samuel and Susan McGoffin. And it turns out that Samuel McGoffin was very instrumental in paving the way for the U.S. Army to come out here. He had become friends of Armijo, the governor, and he continued to work on him and say, this is going to be good for you, you don't need to worry. And up until the last moment, Armijo said he had 6,000 men who were going to fight the Americans when they came. But at the last minute, he withdrew. And so the American Army was able to come in very peacefully and take over Santa Fe and New Mexico. And then Susan wrote a very interesting diary, and for many years we thought she was the first American woman to cross on the Santa Fe Trail. Later, more recently, it's been discovered that it was really Mary Donahoe who was the first American woman to come out. The McGoffins rented a house near a church, they said, and that house became the center of society with the military here and the McGoffins, who were leaders in the community at that interesting time. Kit Carson was then asked to be the scout for the American Army to go out to California. And of course, that's another story that we could go into. Santa Fe and the hotel flourished. With the Army in town, the hotel became the focal point of social life. In 1848, new lessees, Humphrey and Coulter. I tried my best to find their first names, but I couldn't find them anywhere. So I will have to be content with Humphrey and Coulter. Everyone else I could find their first names, but not these two. And there were new managers, Frank Green and Thomas Bowler. They had experience somewhere else and were very, very active, and they definitely knew how to run a hotel. So they went down to Chihuahua City and got hotel people who had experience to come up here and help run the hotel. And they also brought up Pancho's Band. And this is about the time they had a renovation of the hotel for $10,000. And this is when Doña Tudas Barceleno, if you've heard of her. She was quite a madame here in the city. She ran a Monte Bank about a block west of the Palace of the Governors. She became quite famous and was somewhat the head of society here. Folks, I'm running out of time. Going to the Exchange Hotel. I love this postcard that the hotel had in its has in its archives of a stagecoach arriving in Santa Fe. It's incredible. And the hotel had new managers. The stagecoach service was inaugurated. The overland stages came out from Missouri to Santa Fe. And one of the most famous stage drivers was Wild Bill Hickok. And his big deal was, as he was bringing the stage into town, these poor people had been traveling a month or more in that little stagecoach. And his big thing was to let the horses go as fast as they could. And they would hit the Santa Fe River in a big splash. Then they'd get into the dirt road of Santa Fe and come in a big cloud of smoke, and all of a sudden come to a screeching halt in front of the hotel. And the passengers, I hate to imagine what condition they were in by that time. That was the Wild Bill Hickok. And Archbishop Lamy arrived in 1851. At that time he was just the bishop, became the archbishop while he was here. Another interesting story is Leonard Rose and Alpha Brown. They were in Keosauqua. Now Keosauqua is a town in Iowa, and they had decided they wanted to go to California. They heard great news about California. Remember, the 49ers had been coming out, so all of America knew about the gold being discovered out there. So they headed for New Mexico with 3 horses, 14 trotting mares, 6 mules, and 140 oxen and cattle. The Roses stopped here in Santa Fe and stayed in the Exchange Hotel for a couple of days. And Mrs. Rose especially liked to do her shopping here after so long traveling across the prairies. And then they went to Albuquerque and headed for California across New Mexico. And notice I say crossing New Mexico. I didn't say Arizona because there was no Arizona at that time. New Mexico stretched all the way out to the Colorado River, which was the border to California. That went on for about 200 years when it was Spanish and Mexican. And so they traveled out there, finally got to the Colorado River, and encountered the Mojave Indians. And the Mojaves acted like they were happy to see them, but in the end it was treacherous. They attacked the wagon train, killed a number of the people, including Alpha Brown, who was supposed to be the leader of the caravan. And they decided, wow, we're not going to California, we'll go back. They came back to Albuquerque. And Mr. Rose worked there for a little while at an odd job. And then he was able to get money from his relatives in the East, enough money to come up to Santa Fe and buy the Exchange Hotel. So they were new owners here. Then we had the American Civil War that took place here, and one of the most interesting characters of all you'll find in the book is Henry Hopkins Sibley. He was the general who brought the army up from Texas, and I noticed in letters by his soldiers that he rarely was seen when there was action on the battlefield. He usually could be found in a wagon they called the ambulance, with a jug of rum in his hand. And he had been serving here in New Mexico in the U.S. Army and knew the place very well, and he certainly liked the Exchange Hotel. He knew what good refreshing drinks they had here. And it appeared to me that he wasn't even here when the battle took place at Gloria de Paz. He did come after a bit. And as most of you probably know, if you know any history here at all, the Confederate Army was unable to win the battle, and that's another story. And so during that time, there was a guy by the name of Parker, Charles G. Parker, who was manager of the Exchange at that time. And he was happy to have so many customers, especially the general, in the bar here at the hotel. And so once the Confederate Army knew they weren't going to be able to go any further, they retreated to Texas. The officials here in Santa Fe arrested the manager of the hotel for selling liquor to soldiers. That was the accusation. And so he had to leave. And Sibley, the rest of his life, after his service in the U.S. Army and in the Confederate Army, he went to live in the East Coast and didn't know what he was going to do, but he was recruited by someone who was looking for people, officers, who could train the Egyptian army. And so he went over to Egypt, but that did not last very long at all, because he was mostly absent without leave on the job. So he finally came back, and he died a pauper at his daughter's house in Virginia. He could have been a millionaire. You know why? He invented a tent called the Sibley tent for the Army. And the U.S. Army bought hundreds of those tents, and they used them. He also invented a stove that could be used in the tents. And these tents would hold about 20 men, when they're out bivouacking in the field. And they were going to give him $5 for every tent. Was it $5 or $10? For every tent that they bought. However, he sided with the Confederates, and he became a general in the Confederate Army. And the U.S. Congress passed a law that anyone who had been in the Confederacy could not receive royalties for tents or stoves. He also invented a trajectory for a cannon, and his great idea was you wrap some cloth around the thing, and it would make it go straighter and longer and farther. But no one caught on to that patent. Anyway, the post-war exchange, it became without Parker there to run it. The management was turned over to C.S. Hinckley and C.E. Blake and D.S. Garland. They were known as the Hinckley, Blake, and Garland organization, and continued to be a very popular place. And there's some more history about the ownership and managers. John Martin, I don't have time to go into his story, but it's very interesting. He discovered that he could drill a well on the part of the trail, the Royal Road going down to Mexico City at a place called the Jornada del Muerte, the journey of the dead man. It was desert. And he discovered he could drill a well out there in the middle, and so he started a cattle ranch and a wagon stop. And then he and his wife got tired of the desert down there, decided to come to the city. They came to Santa Fe and bought the Exchange Hotel. So all of these stories lead back to this very property where we're sitting, and it's quite interesting to hear about that. Some very important people arrived. Then in the 1870s, General Lou Wallace and his wife Susan arrived in 1878. They stayed briefly in the hotel until the Governor Axtell could be kicked out of the Palace of the Governors. Axtell didn't know that he was being replaced, but Wallace came with letters from the president showing that he was now to be the governor. And of course, if you don't know his story, that's very interesting, because he became the author of the most popular novel during the 19th century, Ben-Hur. So another interesting character comes into this story. And the first trains arrived in 1880. President Ulysses S. Grant, U.S. Grant, was out here. He had just been president. He became president of a mining company here in Santa Fe. And Rutherford B. Hayes, the new president, also made a visit here. And that's another story. And this was the time of the Lincoln County War, and Billy the Kid raising havoc down there. He was the biggest problem that the governor had during those times. And then he was brought here and put in jail before he was sent south to be tried for murder. There's a picture of the Exchange Hotel, and there was a new owner, Abraham Stock, who became one of the most wealthy landowners in Santa Fe during that time. He had a lot of land, and he bought into the hotel, and he had a partner, Dr. Robert Longwell. Both of those people have long stories as well. And his big innovation for the hotel was to have retail shops. So he's the father of retailing shops in hotels. And the problem was there were other hotels being established. There was the Harlow's on San Francisco Street on the other side of the plaza, the Grand Central Hotel, the Palace, and enters into the story here at that time a very special person, Sister Blandina Sigali. She was an Italian woman who came out to work as a nurse, and her story is another one, and I do cover her story much more in my 1880 book than I do in this book that we're looking at today. The only thing they could say about when the trains arrive, instantly the old Santa Fe Trail died. That was the end of the Santa Fe Trail, because everything came out in the train. And so the hotel had to do something about getting patronage, so they started advertising it as the best located hotel in Santa Fe. And rooms were $1.50 per day, and there's a floor plan of the hotel. It never had more than 10 or 12 rooms, but it had a lot of room as you can see there, for the casino and dining rooms and the bar and so on. So that indicates to us all that this was really a social gathering place, as much as it was a hotel. And in the back, down here at the bottom, were the stables where the patrons would hide their wagon and have their horses taken care of. The last days of the Fonda and the new days of the La Fonda. In 1910, 1919, the exchange went from shabby to being an eyesore in the city. And newer hotels had steam-heated rooms, electric lights, telephones. They were very luxurious. And the old exchange just could not live up to that. And so the city leaders started demanding that the hotel be replaced. At the same time, there was this excitement about the idea of new old Santa Fe. New old Santa Fe. There was an exhibit in the Palace of the Governors about this, and people were starting to think, hey, we're old enough, we have certain things here that maybe other communities don't have, and we do want to have more people visiting. And so they really started the tourist industry at that time. And that became the driving force, and that's how this hotel turned out to be what it is today. In 1960, the city council threatened condemnation proceedings against the old hotel. And I have a picture in the book of the hotel in its last days. But I get sentimental about the old hotel, and I don't like to look at that picture. I decided I needed to put it in the book for the record, but it really looks sad. And I get pretty emotional about seeing that picture of the hotel in its last days. So I'm not showing it to you today, but I did want to tell you how they got rid of this hotel. It was the end of the war, and it was 1919, and they were selling war bonds. They had a huge party here in the plaza to sell war bonds. And they had an old army tank. You can hardly see it there, and I apologize for that. You see it here on the left side. But that's the best photograph we have of what happened in those days. But anyone who bought a $100 war bond could either ride in the tank and push down a wall, or they could sponsor the tank going and pushing down one of the walls of the old hotel. So that's how they got rid of the old hotel, the Exchange, and made room for this building when it was started in 1919. The Santa Fe style became the great thing in those days. A subscription drive raised $200,000 for a new building here. Local people contributed to that. The architectural firm of Rapp and Henriksen was commissioned to design the new building. They had built a number of buildings in this style around the territory, and they really pushed the idea of the new old Santa Fe. And the hotel would include a courtyard, as you had seen it out here, which is now the La Plazuela, and it would have balconies and vigas projecting out from the front. So it was the birth of the Santa Fe style, and the building was completed in 1922, and that's how we have the centennial year this year. And it was purchased by the Santa Fe Improvement Company, which actually was a subsidiary of the Santa Fe Railroad, and then it was leased to the Fred Harvey Company. And for the rest of the story, there's a great book called Appetite for America And that author does an incredible job about telling the rest of the story. But I was happy that I could bring you the first part of the story. Now, I mentioned Matt Field several times, and he was not only an actor, he was quite an incredible writer, and he wrote a lot of poetry and poise. He was incredible. I decided he does such a beautiful job setting the stage. And so at the beginning of each chapter, I have one of his quotes. And as I close, I'd just like to share 3 of those with you, so you get an idea of how he was so good with words. And the first one is this one, and then we'll finish. Bricks molded from prairie clay and roasted on the noontide ray, large as the stones of city halls, form good, strong built walls, and trunks and boughs of cottonwood form gates and beams and rafters good. Another one. Now they're bridging over the stream. This is a wonderful description of the wagons and what they were going through to get here. Now they are bridging o'er the stream to pass across each loaded team, throwing in heavy brush and grass to bear the wagons as they pass, to keep the skittish mules from falling and guard the sinking wheels from stalling. And double teams they still require to drag the wagons through the mire. Behold, with what a fearful pitch the lumbering wagon jumps the ditch. See how the frightened mules are staring. Hear the whips crack and drivers swearing. I love it. Here's another one, prose, describing an evening in Santa Fe. Night now was closing rapidly, and in the eastern sky the stars came peeping out, bathing radiance as the golden flood of light sank fading behind the mountains. The vast prairies were folded away in a heavy mantle of gloom. Tinkling bells were heard no more. A crescent moon came smiling from the far horizon, and starry night succeeded. Santa Fe never slept beneath a lovelier night, and night never followed a more beautiful evening. That's Matt Field, and so I'm happy I was able to use his quotes at the beginning of each chapter. Folks, thank you so much for your patience and for your interest. It's, as you can see, I've been on quite a journey with this book. And as I said, there are so many stories going out, even in each chapter. It's quite an incredible experience to go through and find all these stories to share with you. I think...
I just want to see if anybody has any questions.
Sure.
At all. This is very open.
First, why is this picture over on the right side?
Why is this picture on the right side? That actually is showing the wagon tracks up at a place near Fort Union, north of Las Vegas. You can see, you know, the sort of a roadway that they finally pounded down in the earth. All the thousands, you know, eventually there were thousands of wagons that came out. And so, yeah, I just like that one. It shows something that happened there, even way out in the middle of nowhere. Yes, sir.
I believe there was an exchange hotel on the plaza in Las Vegas in the 1880s. Was that related to the...
You know, that name was not a very special name because in many cities there was an exchange hotel. So it just seemed to be the fad in those days. If you wanted to get prestige, name it the exchange hotel. So, yes.
So was it the United States, was it a hotel then, or was it really just a guest house when it was here?
Well, you know, in those days, the question was it just a guest house or was it really a hotel? In those days, it was a little difficult to distinguish a hotel from a guest house. As you saw, this one was quite small. And it actually did become a boarding house in its last days. And there's an incredible description of the inside of the hotel at that time. You'll find it in the book. very touching, very beautifully written of the old hotel as it was dying. So, and there were, by the way, there were a couple murders committed in the old hotel. Given the atmosphere of today, you know, with what's happening in Europe, I decided I wasn't going to get into too many of the gory details. So,
I have one more question, Alan. So how does the Santa Fe Improvement Company relate to the railroads? Because I thought this was bordered by the railroad.
that's a great question. How was the
Maybe you should go think of
how was the Santa Fe Improvement Company related to the railroad? It was established by the railroad company, and I don't know how many of you know, there is a Santa Fe ranch out in California. It's near San Diego, down in San Diego County. And it was started by this company. And they organized this company to be a branch of the railroad company. They were planning to make railroad ties out there out of a eucalyptus forest. But they soon discovered that eucalyptus doesn't work for railroad ties. And so they said, oh, well, let's turn it into a town. So there's Rancho Santa Fe out there now. And that was the company, and it was a legal company, so it was, you know, just the way to
It's
go.
like an offshoot of the railroad.
Yes.
Kind of,
Yeah, it was part of the railroad. Yes.
Hey, Alan, I don't know why I'm thinking this, but was there a butcher shop or a meat shop in the hotel at one time?
Oh, yes, yes.
It's later.
Yeah.
Butcher shop?
And near the end, there was a grocer who owned the hotel. And they had a butcher shop, grocery store, and all. Yeah. Yes.
Is there like an underground tunnel that went from the hotel to?
That I don't know. Was there an underground tunnel? Ed, I don't know anything about that.
I don't think you've heard it.
I'll have to ask Ed. Was there an underground tunnel?
Ed, was there an underground tunnel?
No, we've never seen any.
I've never-
I think
And I can say the back of the house is just as interesting as the front of the house.
Yeah.
And when you start renovating, we start digging out walls, you'll get to something, all of a sudden it's like, oh boy, what's this?
Yeah.
But no, Tony.
Yeah, I've never seen anything about that. I've heard it.
Heard the rumor.
I've heard the rumor about that. Very good.
Alan, thank you so much.